Hey guys, how's everybody doing? What a great group. I got here early and got to experience some virtual reality. It's great to be here at World's Fair Nano, and they just gave me a simple topic, the future of American leadership. You have been here for 2 days hearing about the future of everything, and you may even be tired of talking about the future, but I'm going to talk about the future in a little bit of a different way when I tackle the topic, the future of American leadership, and I'm glad to do it. I want to talk about the future of American leadership on September 17th, 1787. Today is the 230th anniversary of the Constitution being completed in Philadelphia. Give it up for the Constitution. And what I want to do is talk about what they were grappling with as they thought about the future of American leadership, and 3 pivotal ideas that they were grappling with that still have a real power as we're thinking about the future of leadership of this country in the world in 2017. So first, let's go back to 1787. We had come through the pain and triumph of the Revolutionary War. And like a lot of times after a triumph, like, Moses getting over the Red Sea, it doesn't just all go smoothly after the triumph. So the Revolutionary War was won. We're independent. Isn't that great? But the government of our country kind of sucked. They didn't know how to create a government, and so what they had was states, but there wasn't really a binding national government that could hold the states together. And so it turned out they had all kinds of challenges in the first year, and they decided we got to get back together to craft a covenant, to craft a document that will forge a national identity and not just be separate states. And so they got together. Now, forgive me, I'm a Virginian. I'm a Virginia-centric person, so I'm going to brag about James Madison. They gave Madison the task of being the principal drafter. Madison also seized another role. He was also the principal note-taker of all the discussions. If you want to have power, volunteer for that job, taking the notes and explaining what was being done, because it's Madison's work as drafter, but also as the note-taker that tells us what they did. What were they grappling with? They wanted to create a national identity, but they had at least 3 fears. Who's learned in elementary school about checks and balances, right? You've all heard that, right? So what were they trying to check and what were they trying to balance? They had at least 3 major fears, and then they put together a document, and I'm going to celebrate 3 ideas that have relevance today. The first fear they had was this. They were trying to create an office of the presidency, but they were worried about a president overreaching and being a power-hungry person on a power grab. What a novel concept. I'm sure that's very arcane. That has no relevance to our situation today. Because in 1787, they knew kings, emperors, monarchs, popes, sultans. They knew strong executive power. They needed an executive. They needed a president, but they wanted to try to check against a tendency to power grabs and abuse. That's the first check. Second check, they were coming out of states, wanted to create a national government, but they didn't want one that would just trample all over states. So there had to be a balance between the new federal government and states. And the third thing, really important, they didn't want a government that would trample on individuals. They wanted individuals to have some space, some breathing room. And so 3 things they were trying to check: executive overreach, national government overreach, and domination of individuals. Now, the Constitution is a very, very full, I could talk about a million things about it, but just today on the 230th anniversary, let me talk about 3 ideas that I think are really important. The first one, nobody talks about when they talk about the Constitution. The first one is this: self-expression was absolutely key. Absolutely key. In 1787, we think of that as a more contemporary thing. Self-expression is everything. No, in 1787 to 1791, they believed it. Here's why. The 7 articles of the Constitution are about how the government is arranged, federal, state, how to ratify, how to amend. But they realized they couldn't get the states to ratify it unless they added a Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments, the first 8 are rights and responsibilities given to individuals. And they could have ordered them in any order they wanted. But the First Amendment is all about self-expression. freedom of speech, freedom of the press. There will be no established state religion, but everyone will be free to worship as they want or not, and they cannot be punished. Freedom to assemble, protest, freedom to petition your government for redress of grievances. The First Amendment is a powerhouse, and they made it first for a reason. We were a nation founded on the idea of self-expression. Why was it going to be about self-expression? Partly to protect individuals from a government crushing them because of their views or religion, but also the founders knew if everybody expresses themselves in innovative, decentralized, diffuse, creative ways, we will create really cool stuff, cool ideas, cool culture, cool products. But if people feel, weighed down and hobbled and that there's an official viewpoint and a bad one, they won't. So the first idea to celebrate from 1787 is they made the First Amendment first for a reason, and everything in it, religion and belief and assembly and protest, it was all about the power of the individual and wanting expression to help enliven our society. That's number one. Second idea, when you talk about the Constitution, checks and balances, people talk about institutions, the three branches and they're co-equal. But what interests me is less the institutions than the roles assigned to everybody. Madison gave a role to everybody. And he believed they would only deal with those problems if everybody played their role. So Congress is the Article I branch. I'm in Congress. In most countries, the executive, the king, would be Article I, but they wanted the people's elected legislative body to be the first among equals. So that's Congress. Article II branch, the president, the powers of the presidency. They wanted strong but not overreaching. Article III branch, everybody know, judiciary. Do you know how weird we are in the way we do judges in this country? In 1787, they decided they wanted judges to have life tenure. Once appointed, you were a judge for life in the federal system. States don't do that today. Most nations don't do that today. Why did they do that? They did it so a judge could look at the President of the United States and say, you can't do that Muslim ban, or Congress, you can't do that, and they couldn't be fired. Judges have a role to play. First Amendment, right of the press has a role to play. Most importantly, all of us as citizens have a role to play. Voting is mentioned in the Constitution, so we're voters. But we're more than just voters. The right of the people to peacefully assemble. They knew people had to be able to assemble and make their voices heard, or our country wouldn't be what it needed to be. The right to petition your government for redress of grievances. Writing, calling, emailing, showing up at your congressperson's home or office. This was part of it. So the second idea that's a powerful one is everybody has a role to play. And Madison and others believed the only way we would succeed is if everybody played the roles that were assigned to them. And the third idea that's really important is we can be wrong. We can be wrong. Or at least we should always try to be better. That's an important concept right in the Constitution. In the preamble, it says, in order to form a more perfect union. There's no such thing as more perfect, but it was an admission of the folks at 1787. We know we're not getting this right. We may not know exactly how wrong we're getting it, but we know we're not getting it right, and so we want every generation to make it better. There's Article 5 of the Constitution, how to amend it. If it was perfect, they wouldn't have had to put that in there. But they put in how to amend the Constitution because they knew we would get it wrong, and they knew every generation should try to get it better. And while I'm talking about the Constitution and celebrating it, did they ever get it wrong? I mean, let's be honest. The draft of the Constitution in 1787, as good as it was, they got it horribly wrong. There were 3 references in the Constitution to slavery, the institution of slavery, but they were so ashamed of the institution of slavery that in each reference, they didn't call it slavery. They came up with a euphemism to kind of hide what it was. A state couldn't pass a law letting a slave from another state who comes into the first state become free. But they described it with a lot of hocus pocus. Congress couldn't outlaw the institution of slavery before a certain date, but they described it with a lot of hocus pocus. And the worst, how do you count slaves as you're trying to figure out who can vote? you count them as 3/5 of a person. But they didn't use the word slaves or slavery. They used a lot of hocus pocus. So they were so ashamed that they wouldn't even be honest about what they were doing. The other thing that was a mistake in the Constitution that's connected is they didn't even mention the word equality. 11 years early, the Declaration of Independence, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. It's the first of the self-evident truths. Lincoln at Gettysburg said it was the proposition upon which the nation is founded. What happened between 1776 and 1787 that they didn't even mention the word equality? So they got it wrong. They knew they would get it wrong. They knew that it would probably have to be fixed. They did get it wrong. We had to fight a war to start to get it right and amend the Constitution to do so. So those are the ideas that I want to celebrate being with you today. And let me now just bring it to the current question of looking forward. That's what they were grappling with in September 17, 1787. How do those ideas have power today? First, self-expression. What's World's Fair Nano about? As I toured virtual reality and was talking to people, you could argue that it was the First Amendment or the values that made them put it first. That's one of the things that's made our nation so strong. Innovation, creativity. You can start, you can fail, you can start again. You don't get an innovative society if people are afraid to say what they think. You don't get a creative society if people can be punished for how they worship or not worship. You don't get a dynamic, progressive economy if every idea you have to step back and think, oh, but am I going to get in trouble for this? Am I going to get put in jail for this? So that idea, it's about self-expression, was powerful in 1787, and it's equally powerful today. And as I travel around the world as a Foreign Relations and Armed Services Committee member, so often what I get asked about is, well, you're a country that still allows people to try a lot of stuff. And not other economies are so quick to allow try and fail and retry. So that's a powerful idea that we still model for the rest of the world. Your tribute to that today. Second idea that we model, everybody's got a role to play. In this country, I mean, I wasn't happy with the election in November, and a lot of people weren't. But here's what you saw. In Washington, D.C., the day after the inauguration, more people turned out in the Women's March in Washington, D.C. than had been at the inauguration, and in women's marches all over the country. A couple weeks later, there was an unannounced, and nobody had advance notice of it, executive announcement that there was going to be a Muslim ban in the country. At least the inauguration, people knew to plan for it. Now there's a Muslim ban announced on a Friday night. Spontaneously, Americans all over the country knew to go out to airports and demonstrate. I went to Dulles Airport, to the international arrival zone, the weekend that was announced, and these were the protesters, a mom with kids and a picture of Mr. Rogers, welcome to my neighborhood. Virginia is for lovers. We're not anti-Muslim. We welcome people from around the world. Spontaneous people peacefully assembling to protest, to petition their government for the redress of grievances, just like Madison said. I went back to the floor of the Senate the following Monday. I was telling my story, how proud I am that people are coming to life and doing what they're supposed to do. And I told the story about Dulles, and a friend of mine in the Senate from Indiana, Joe Donnelly, said, Tim, same thing happened in Indianapolis. People just turned out to the airport. We have no international flights. They were hugging people from Columbus, Ohio, getting off flights and saying, we're not anti-immigrant, we love you. But all around the country, spontaneously, it's coming to life. You see judges standing up and telling the President of the United States, you can't do this. You see the New York Times and the Washington Post press stories like a slam dunk contest every day, investigative journalists doing their things. We're living through the stress test of our constitutional democracy, folks. But what we're seeing is that people are playing the roles that are assigned to them, and the institutions still have vitality. Last thing, we can still get it wrong. We got to be humble. We got to scrap the America is the indispensable nation. America is exceptional. We don't have to follow the rules that others do. We have to scrap the pride talk. That's not what the framers said. They said we were likely to get it wrong, and they set up mechanisms to correct it when we were wrong. And so one of the things that we have to do circa 2017 is grapple with our own capacity for error, be courageous enough to be self-critical, Acknowledge areas where we're weak. Racial inequalities persist in the criminal justice system, in the economy. We do a horrible job of electing women to federal office in this country. Do you know we're 100th in the world in the percentage of women in our national legislative body at about 19 or 20%? Iraq is 26%. Afghanistan's 28%. Rwanda is in the mid-60s. We don't do a good job at that. There's other things we're not doing a good job at. We got to be courageous enough to be self-critical, just as they were, and acknowledge we're going to get it wrong and endeavor to fix it. So those three ideas, the roles allotted to everybody, the power of self-expression, and we can get it wrong, and we have to be courageous enough to acknowledge and fix our ideas, we're celebrating 230 years later. I want to tell you two last stories and then take some questions about American leadership in the world, because leadership isn't just about, I'm on the Armed Services Committee. I want to have a great national defense, but it's not just about defense. You know, we became the most powerful nation in the world about 1900. Our economy got to be the largest in 1890. With the Roosevelt presidency, we built up the military. Woodrow Wilson turned us into a sort of a peacemaker globally. So diplomacy, economy, military, we assume primacy, and we are in a very dominant position for a very long time. Our economy now is not the biggest in the world. All a Chinese worker has to be is 1/5 as productive as an American worker. Their GDP will be higher. So we're probably still higher, but in a couple of years, we won't be the biggest GDP. We don't have the super military edge over everybody, or we wouldn't have been subjected to the cyber attack of our presidential election by another adversary. So there's more parity in the world, but U.S. leadership is still needed. I'm going to give you two examples. I have a friend named Sedef Kakmak, and Sedef is a city councilwoman in Istanbul. Sedef organized the first Istanbul Pride Parade in about 2003, and she had 15 people. And by 2013 or 14, she had 75,000 people. And then the government at that point has been cracking down and not letting them have a pride parade. But as I've gotten to know Sedef and I've talked to her, what she has said very powerfully is, if I didn't have the example of the United States advancing on LGBT equality, which connects all the way back to the Equality Promise, I couldn't have done what I've done in Istanbul. If I didn't have a U.S. consulate in Istanbul that I could always go to and get help, I couldn't have done what I've done in Istanbul. That's American leadership. Painful, slow, but also exciting, the progress we've made on LGBT equality, which is just the next chapter. It's always about knocking down a wall of inequality, and then there's another wall of inequality that you got to pursue. We're influencing people around the world. Second story, I'm very close to John McCain, U.S. Senator. And here was a picture that I found that I gave to John a couple years ago. The USS John McCain, which is named after his grandfather, who was also a Navy officer, docking in Da Nang Harbor, Vietnam, with the entire Vietnamese military brass standing and saluting it in the last couple of years. In the Vietnamese War, we lost 60,000 Americans and tens of thousands injured, and the Vietnamese lost probably somewhere between 1.5 million and 3 million people injured. That was in my lifetime. And yet here we are. We've reopened diplomatic relationships with Vietnam. We have a close relationship. We don't agree on everything, but they don't want to forget about the U.S. or consign us to some other category after this horrific war. No, they want a more robust partnership with the United States. That's the leadership role that we play when we're at our best. Our role in the 21st century will be very different than it was in the 20th. I think we ought to scrap all the indispensability and hubris and exceptionalism and just try to be exemplary. You're more likely to be indispensable if you try to be exemplary than if you try to be indispensable. So let's try to be exemplary around these fundamental values, some of which bubbled up 230 years ago today. With that, thank you. I'd love to take some questions. Appreciate it.
Questions, hands up. Does anyone have a question? We got some over there.
Of course, it's going to be on the other side of the room from where you are. And now the next question, all the way on the other side of the room, so Doug has to run all the way back over. Please, introduce yourself, please.
Hi, my name is Riham.
Hey, Riham.
I'm from Saudi Arabia. My question is, For me in specific, and I think for everyone in the Middle East, we consider the U.S. as a world leader. We consider whoever is set as a president kind of like, in a way, responsible for the whole world.
Yeah.
And my question is, do you think the regular individual American understand when they elect a president that they're not electing an American president?
That's
Yeah.
yeah. So, did everybody hear the question? Yeah, great question. So do American voters, when they elect somebody, understand the role that the American president plays around the world? And I don't really think the majority of voters do. You know, we inherited sort of a blessing and sort of a curse. The fact that we have oceans on the east and west border that separate us from the problems of the east and west have enabled us to be somewhat insular and not think so much about the challenges around the world. Now, we've always had great global leaders and diplomats and explorers and innovators, but in terms of what is occupying our daily attention, George Washington cited this as a great gift we would have, is because of our oceans on both sides. We didn't need to entangle ourselves so much around the world. So I think that in elections, if I'm campaigning for myself or if I'm campaigning on a national ticket and I just open it up for questions, 80-90% of the questions will be about a domestic issue, and it's a rare person that asks a question about a national security or domestic issue. And yet, that is a critical part of the job. And we've had American presidents who have seized that. Harry Truman, after World War II, when we were war-weary, nevertheless crafted a doctrine, the Truman Doctrine, that lasted during multiple presidencies of both parties and multiple Congresses of both parties. He embraced that role for the United States. I think we're currently living through a time, and other nations are going through too, where there's a little bit of an isolationist phenomenon. And you can understand it rationally, 15, 16 years of war in Iraq and Syria and Afghanistan, and when's it going to end, and are we doing it right? Are we accomplishing anything? Are we even appreciated? It's making people pull back a little bit. But we can turn our back on the world, but the world ain't turning their back on us. And so we're going to be engaged in the world. We just have to decide if we're going to be proactive or reactive. I have to let the man with the mic, I think, do the, yeah, please.
Hi, I'm Caroline.
Hey, Caroline.
Hi. My question is, what gives you hope? You have an inside view into the government that I think we all wish we had, or maybe not, maybe we don't wish it at all, but you have that. And my question is, what gives you hope after Charlottesville? Even our president, for a time, couldn't admit that it was white supremacy, and some of your own colleagues couldn't. And when you have that kind of despair, you know, and like, how can these people with so much power not even admit, you know, one of the biggest issues of our time?
Yeah.
How do you, when you walk into that room, when you see this kind of operation, what gives you hope that we can overcome this kind of a
Fantastic
problem?
question. A comment about the president's reaction, then an answer to your question. When a young Somali American drove a car into a crowd of people in Columbus, Ohio in December, President-elect Trump immediately called it terrorism and immediately went to Columbus to meet with the victims who had been injured. When somebody drove a car into a crowd in Las Ramblas in Barcelona a couple weeks back, a couple days after Charlottesville, he immediately called it terrorism. Immediately. When London attack happened a couple of days ago, even before it was completely known, he immediately called it terrorism. So when a white supremacist takes a vehicle and drives it into a crowd of people 90 miles from the national capital in the home of an archetypal American president and kills Heather Heyer, a beautiful 32-year-old paralegal, kills 2 Virginia state troopers, both of whom I knew quite well. And suddenly he doesn't know what to say about it. He doesn't know what it is. He said there's good people on both sides, or there's violence on both sides. That was the clearest indication of a complete moral vacuum that is now in the White House. And I'll tell you, bluntly, Americans are learning a lesson that's a painful one, or relearning. Most lessons in life you have to relearn. And the lesson is this: 63 million people accepted promises of greatness when there was no evidence of goodness. There was no evidence of goodness, but what? We're going to accept the promise of greatness. So, but what gives me hope? 90% of the ralliers in Charlottesville who were doing bad things were from out of state. Everyone that's been arrested is from out of state. And why does that matter? Virginia was the capital of the Confederacy. The first slaves came into the English colonies, captured off Portuguese slave ships, and brought to Jamestown, Virginia in 1619. We have been in the belly of the beast of American history in Virginia, but we're moving ahead. We were the first state to elect an African-American governor. We went for Barack Obama twice. And cities like Charlottesville are saying, well, we're listening to our citizens now. We're putting away the old stuff. We're going to look in the windshield, not in the rearview mirror. And we're going to think differently about our history and explain it differently. The fact that a state like Virginia, which has been there, done that, got the scar tissue, has decided to close the door and face forward and move ahead, that's what gives me hope. That's what gives me hope. Now, if you are a bitter ender about a fantasy about the past, you may have a psychosis in your head about Virginia, and you may want to come to Virginia because you don't like to see Virginia moving ahead. But what I tell everybody is, if you think, I don't care how many white supremacists, or I don't care how you try to embolden them or equivocate about them from the White House, if you think you can stop Virginia from going forward, you can't. We know the pain of this too well. We've put it behind us. We're moving forward. And I see evidence of this all over the country. Young people running for office, voting turnout up, people getting off the sidelines, people seeing, okay, if that's what's on the other side, then I'm just going to not just write a letter to the editor. I'm going to go out and be really vigorous and active. So it is the very life in these institutions I was describing and the vitality of them that is apparent to me since January of 2017 that gives me the most hope.
How you doing?
Great.
Arthur from New York.
Hey, Arthur.
We've seen a pattern of extreme swinging from Democrat to Republican over the past 5-6 presidents. You can easily track that. How far in the future are we going to see a third party, fourth party viable and a move away from the professional politician into the young politician that you were talking about, or even this cult of celebrity politician? And is that a concern for you?
Yeah, that's two very good questions. So on the new party thing, if I had to project forward, I don't think there would be a third or fourth party that will be really powerful. Instead, what we see happening is more and more Americans identifying as independents. And I see this I have 3 20-somethings, just kind of among the way they look at things. We're sort of free agent people, more than we're joiners of big institutions and organizations. And so right now, if you poll Americans, about 30% Dem, about 30% Republican, 40% independent. My prediction is the independent number is going to grow, and the identified with the party numbers are going to shrink. And then the independents will be the power block, and they will have to decide, do we just pick between a Republican and Democratic candidate? Do we go to our state legislature and try to make it easy for independents to run? I actually think if you went to Congress 20 years from now, one thing you're likely to see is a lot more independents serving in Congress. States make it hard now to be on the ballot as independents. But I think to have 40% of the population be independents, but have it hard to be on the ballot as independent, that's an incongruity that I think will arrange. So I think you'll see that more quickly than you'll see the growth of strong parties. The celebrity thing kind of troubles me. Now look, celebrity it's like a superpower. It can be used for good or evil, right? So, just like being a lawyer can be used for good or evil. So it's just like anything else. But, you want people, you want people in life who have an obvious desire to sort of sacrifice, and it's not about their ego. And we already have a lot of egomaniacs in politics. I mean, it's really hard not to. And so the celebrity person, I worry about it on the ego side. So, I don't have a comforting answer to give you about that one.
Okay, we have time for one more question.
Okay.
Just go right front center right here.
Senator
You did a full lap. Give Doug a round of applause, man. Yeah.
Senator Kaine, my name's Marlena Saranac, and I'm a first-generation American. I grew up in a blue-collar town, Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. And when Bethlehem Steel went away, a lot of the blue-collar jobs also went away. And I actually had the privilege of asking this question earlier to Adea Ressi, and I'm curious to hear what you have to say about it. While we're here talking about really exciting, awesome, innovative things like automation, AI, robotics, what does this mean for the future of the blue-collar workforce, and what does the future look like in terms of employing people who fall into this category? And as potentially future leaders who are coming back to our communities, how do we reinvent what it means to be a blue-collar worker and get these people good jobs?
Great question. And I loved visiting Bethlehem when I was on the campaign trail, and I didn't know I was going to be walking into una comunidad tan latino como Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. El número de latinos allá es tan grande, and that's not what I was expecting to see. So Bethlehem is a really interesting story in a lot of ways. On Friday, 2 days ago, I was in Glade Spring, Virginia, which is in Appalachia, visiting a manufacturing plant. And we hear a lot about the decline in American manufacturing, and to some degree it's true because of technology. You know, production is high, but a lot of it's done by machines with fewer workers. But I was in a plant where they are persistently trying to hire manufacturing employees who are skilled in things like welding. My dad was a welder, and they can't find them because we've perpetrated sort of a false view of education, probably in the last 40 years, where it was all about college, community college and college, and we didn't hold up career and technical training as completely equally valid and valuable. And when you don't hold it up as parents or teachers or guidance counselors, and then kids don't go into it, we're in a situation now where we bring in welders on foreign specialty visas to make fantastic salaries because we're not training enough here. And there are other technical fields that are the same. So the first thing that we've got to do is make sure, whether it's in middle school, high school, what can you get a Pell Grant for? You can't get a Pell Grant for a career and technical program. It's got to be on a community college campus. What can you get a military tuition assistance benefit for? Got to be a community college. Can't be for taking the welding certification exam. Can't do it. So we have to be more truthful, really, and more forward-thinking about what education is after high school, and celebrate all acquisition of knowledge, skills, credentials, etc. That's the first thing, human capital. We got to be more vigorous about immigration. Look, immigration reform helps our economy grow. It helps populate regions with industrious people who want to do cool things. When I was born, Virginia, 1 out of 100 people had been born in another country. We were 36th in the nation per capita income, 1958. Today, we're 1 out of 9 people born in another country, and we're 12th in the nation in per capita income. No state has moved farther from back to front than Virginia has in my lifetime, and a lot of it has been off immigration. That's part of it. And then the last thing we have to do, look, you can have skills and you can bring people in, but a lot of rural America, and Bethlehem isn't rural America, but a lot of rural America is not accessible, whether it's by transportation or telecom infrastructure. And if you haven't built out that infrastructure and connected people, then they're going to feel like they're in a cul-de-sac with no direction for themselves. And so some of that is about investments. I disagree with President Trump on a lot of things. If he wants to do infrastructure investments in this country, I'm going to be working with him, because there are a lot of parts of the country that really feel completely left out. And we have to put in the infrastructure that enables them to be connected. Very good questions. Thanks so much. Thanks so much.
One final thing.
Yeah.
You had mentioned that you were a mean harmonica player. So I was wondering if you could give us a little taste here today to close it out.
Well,
you want to hear Tim play a little harmonica?
Doug, I will do it on one condition.
What's that?
If these people will sing.
Yeah?
Will you sing partly to drown out my harmonica playing? I mean, at least, if only that. All right, so I will. You know, it's funny you should mention it. I just happen to have a harmonica. So here's what I'll do. I've talked about this as a time of great civic activism, right? And the best American songwriter of civic activism was Woody Guthrie. And Woody Guthrie was from Okemah, Oklahoma, and then went out with the Dust Bowl out to California, and then came to New York and lived in Brooklyn. And he wrote a lot of his great songs in Brooklyn. including this one that you all know. I know you learned this when you were in elementary school, right? So we're going to play a song written in Brooklyn that is a great song for this time or any time. This land is your land. And I'm going to play it so you'll hear, you'll get the key, and then we'll sing it together, okay? This land is your land, this land is my land, from California to the New York Island, from the redwood forest to the Gulf Stream water. This land was made for you and me. I'll do 2 verses. As I was walking, you know this too, that ribbon of highway, I saw above me that endless skyway. I saw below me the golden valley. This land was made for you and me. Okay, back to the chorus. This land is your land.
Everybody.
This land is my land. Stand up. From California to the New York Island, from the redwood forest to the Gulf Stream water. This land was made for you and me. Here's a good verse. As I went walking, I saw a sign, and the sign, well, it said no trespassing, but on the other side, it didn't say nothing. This land was made for you and me. You sing and I'll play. This land is your land.
To the New York Island, from the forest, and the Gulf. This land was made for you and me.
All right, good
Tim
job,
Kaine,
guys.
everybody.
Go get them World's Fair Nano.